The Ascent of Mount Carmel by St. John of the Cross, Chapter 15, wherein is explained how it is sometimes well for progressives who are beginning to enter upon this general knowledge of contemplation to make use of natural reasoning and the work of the natural faculties. With regard to that which has been said, there might be raised one question. If progressives, that is, those whom God is beginning to bring into this supernatural knowledge of contemplation whereof we have spoken, must never again, because of this that they are beginning to experience, return to the way of meditation and reasoning and natural forms. To this the answer is that it is not to be understood that such as are beginning to experience this loving knowledge must, as a general rule, never again try to return to meditation. For when they are first making progress in proficiency, the habit of contemplation is not yet so perfect that they can give themselves to the act thereof whensoever they wish. Nor in the same way have they reached a point so far beyond meditation that they cannot occasionally meditate and reason in a natural way, as they were wont, using the figures and steps that they were wont to use, and finding something new in them. Rather, in these early stages, when by means of the indications already given, they are able to see that the soul is not occupied in that repose and knowledge, they will need to make use of meditation until, by means of it, they come to acquire in some degree of perfection the habit which we have described. This will happen when, as soon as they seek to meditate, they experience this knowledge in peace, and find themselves unable to meditate and no longer desirous of doing so, as we have said. For until they reach this stage, which is that of the proficient in this exercise, they use sometimes the one and sometimes the other, at different times. The soul, then, will frequently find itself in this loving or peaceful state of waiting upon God, without in any way exercising its faculties, that is, with respect to particular acts, and without working actively at all, but only receiving. In order to reach this state, it will frequently need to make use of meditation, quietly and in moderation. But when the soul is once brought into this other state, it acts not at all with its faculties, as we have already said. It would be truer to say that understanding and sweetness work in it, and are wrought within it, than that the soul itself works at all, save only by waiting upon God, and by loving Him, without desiring to feel or see anything. Then God communicates Himself to it passively, even as one who has his eyes open, so that light is communicated to him passively, without his doing more than keep them open. And this reception of light, which is infused supernaturally, is passive understanding. We say that the soul works not at all, not because it understands not, but because it understands things without taxing its own industry, and receives only that which is given to it, as comes to pass in the illuminations and enlightenments, or inspirations, of God. Although in this condition the will freely receives this general and confused knowledge of God, it is needful, in order that it may receive this divine light more simply and abundantly, only that it should not try to interpose other lights which are more palpable, whether forms or ideas or figures having to do with any kind of meditation, for none of these things is similar to that pure and serene light. So that, if at this time the will desires to understand and consider particular things, however spiritual they be, this would obstruct the pure and simple general light of the Spirit, by setting those clouds in the way, even as a man might set something before his eyes which impeded his vision, and kept from him both the light and the sight of things in front of him. Hence it clearly follows that when the soul has completely purified and voided itself of all forms and images that can be apprehended, it will remain in this pure and simple light, being transformed therein into a state of perfection, For although this light never fails in the soul, it is not infused into it because of the creature forms and veils wherewith the soul is veiled and embarrassed. But if these impediments and these veils were wholly removed, as will be said hereafter, the soul would then find itself in a condition of pure detachment and poverty of spirit, and being simple and pure would be transformed into simple and pure wisdom, which is the Son of God. For the enamored soul finds that which is natural has failed it, and it is then imbued with that which is divine, both naturally and supernaturally, so that there may be no vacuum in its nature. When the spiritual person cannot meditate, let him learn to be still in God, fixing his loving attention upon Him in the calm of his understanding, though he may think himself to be doing nothing. For thus, little by little and very quickly, divine calm and peace will be infused into his soul, together with a wondrous and sublime knowledge of God, enfolded in divine love. And let him not meddle with forms, meditations, and imaginings, or with any kind of reasoning, lest his soul be disturbed and brought out of its contentment and peace, which can only result in its experiencing distaste and repugnance. And if, as we have said, such a person has scruples that he is doing nothing, let him note that he is doing no small thing by pacifying the soul and bringing it into calm and peace, unaccompanied by any act or desire. For it is this that our Lord asks of us through David, saying, Vacate et videte quoniam ego sum Deus, as though he had said, Learn to be empty of all things, that is, inwardly and outwardly, and you will see that I am God. End of part 15. Chapter 16, which treats of the imaginary apprehensions that are supernaturally represented in the fancy, describing how they cannot serve the soul as a proximate means of union with God. Now that we have treated of the apprehensions which the soul can receive within itself by natural means, and whereon the fancy and the imagination can work by means of reflection, it will be suitable to treat here of the supernatural apprehensions which are called imaginary visions, which likewise belong to these senses, since they come within the category of images, forms, and figures, exactly as do the natural apprehensions. It must be understood that beneath this term imaginary vision, we purpose to include all things which can be represented to the imagination supernaturally, by means of any image, form, figure, or species. For all the apprehensions and species, which through all the 5 bodily senses are represented to the soul, and dwell within it after a natural manner, may likewise occur in the soul after a supernatural manner, and be represented to it without any assistance of the outward senses. For this sense of fancy, together with memory, is, as it were, an archive and storehouse of the understanding, wherein are received all forms and images that can be understood. And thus the soul has them within itself, as if it were in a mirror, having received them by means of the 5 senses, or, as we say, supernaturally, and thus it presents them to the understanding, whereupon the understanding considers them and judges them. And not only so, but the soul can also prepare and imagine others like to those with which it is acquainted. It must be understood, then, that even as the 5 outward senses represent the images and species of their objects to those inward senses, even so, supernaturally, as we say, without using the outward senses, both God and the devil can represent the same images and species, and much more beautiful and perfect ones. Wherefore, beneath these images, God often represents many things to the soul, and teaches it much wisdom. This is continually seen in the Scriptures, as when Isaiah saw God in his glory beneath the smoke which covered the temple, and beneath the seraphim who covered their faces and their feet with wings. And as Jeremiah saw the rod watching, and Daniel a multitude of visions, etc. And the devil too strives to deceive the soul with his visions, which in appearance are good, as may be seen in the book of the Kings, when he deceived all the prophets of Ahab, presenting to their imagination the horns wherewith he said the king was to destroy the Assyrians, which was a lie. Even such were the visions of Pilate's wife, warning him not to condemn Christ. And there are many other places where it is seen how, in this mirror of the fancy and the imagination, these imaginary visions come more frequently to proficients than do outward and bodily visions. These, as we say, differ not in their nature, that is, as being images and species, from those which enter by the outward senses, but with respect to the effect which they produce, and in the degree of their perfection, there is a great difference. For imaginary visions are subtler, and produce a deeper impression upon the soul, inasmuch as they are supernatural and more interior than the exterior supernatural visions. Nevertheless, it is true that some of these exterior bodily visions may produce a deeper impression. The communication, after all, is as God wills. We are speaking, however, merely as concerns their nature, and in this respect they are more spiritual. It is to these senses of imagination and fancy that the devil habitually betakes himself with his wiles, now natural, now supernatural. For they are the door and entrance to the soul. And here, as we have said, the understanding comes to take up or set down its goods, as if it were in a harbor or in a storehouse where it keeps its provisions. And for this reason it is hither that both God and the devil always come with their jewels of supernatural forms or images, to offer them to the understanding. Although God does not make use of this means alone to instruct the soul, but dwells within it in substance, and is able to do this by himself and by other methods. There is no need for me to stop here in order to give instruction concerning the signs by which it may be known which visions are of God and which not, and which are of one kind and which of another. For this is not my intention, which is only to instruct the understanding herein, that it may not be hindered or impeded, as to union with divine wisdom, by the good visions, neither may it be deceived by those which are false. I say then that with regard to all these imaginary visions and apprehensions, and all other forms and species whatsoever, which present themselves beneath some particular kind of knowledge or image or form, whether they be false and come from the devil, or are recognized as true and coming from God, the understanding must not be embarrassed by them or feed upon them, neither must the soul desire to receive them or have them, lest it should no longer be detached, free, pure, and simple, without any mode or manner, as is required for union. The reason of this is that all these forms which we have already mentioned are always represented in the apprehension of the soul, as we have said, beneath certain modes and manners which have limitations, and that the wisdom of God, wherewith the understanding is to be united, has no mode or manner, neither is it contained within any particular or distinct kind of intelligence or limit, because it is wholly pure and simple. And as, in order that these two extremes may be united, namely, the soul and divine wisdom, it will be necessary for them to attain to agreement by means of a certain mutual resemblance. Hence it follows that the soul must be pure and simple, neither bounded by nor attached to any particular kind of intelligence, nor modified by any limitation of form, species, and image. As God comes not within any image or form, neither is contained within any particular kind of intelligence, so the soul, in order to reach God, must likewise come within no distinct form or kind of intelligence. And that there is no form or likeness in God is clearly declared by the Holy Spirit in Deuteronomy, where he says, Vocem verborum eius audistis, et formam penitus non vidistis, which signifies, ye heard the voice of his words, and ye saw in God no form whatsoever. But he says that there was darkness there, and clouds and thick darkness, which are the confused and dark knowledge whereof we have spoken, wherein the soul is united with God. And afterwards he says further, Non vidistis aliquam similitudinem in die, qua locutus est vobis Dominus in Horeb de medio ignis. Ye saw no likeness in God upon the day when he spoke to you on Mount Horeb, out of the midst of the fire. And that the soul cannot reach the height of God, even as far as is possible in this life, by means of any form or figure, is declared likewise by the same Holy Spirit in the book of Numbers, where God reproves Aaron and Miriam, the brother and sister of Moses, because they murmured against him, and desiring to convey to them the loftiness of the state of union and friendship with him, wherein he had placed him, said, Si quis inter vos fuerit propheta Domini, in visione apparebo ei, vel persomnium loquar ad illum. At non talis servus meus Moises, qui in omni domo mea fidelissimus est, ore enim ad os loquor ei, et palem, et non per enigmata, et figuras dominum videt. Which signifies, if there be any prophet of the Lord among you, I will appear to him in some vision or form, or I will speak with him in his dreams. But there is none like my servant Moses, who is the most faithful in all my house, and I speak with him mouth to mouth, and he sees not God by comparisons, similitudes, or figures. Herein he says clearly that in this lofty state of union whereof we are speaking, God is not communicated to the soul by means of any disguise of imaginary vision or similitude or form. Neither can he be so communicated, but mouth to mouth, that is, in the naked and pure essence of God, which is the mouth of God in love, with the naked and pure essence of the soul, which is the mouth of the soul in love of God. Wherefore, in order to come to this essential union of love in God, the soul must have a care not to lean upon imaginary visions, nor upon forms or figures or particular objects of the understanding. For these cannot serve it as a proportionate and proximate means to such an end. Rather, they would disturb it, and for this reason the soul must renounce them and strive not to have them. For if in any circumstances they were to be received and prized, it would be for the sake of profit, which true visions bring to the soul, and the good effect which they produce upon it. But for this to happen, it is not necessary to receive them. Indeed, for the soul's profit, it is well always to reject them. For these imaginary visions, like the outward bodily visions whereof we have spoken, do the soul good by communicating to it intelligence or love or sweetness. But for this effect to be produced on the soul by them in the soul, it is not necessary that it should desire to receive them. For as has also been said above, at the very time when they are present to the imagination, they produce in the soul and infuse into it intelligence and love, or sweetness, or whatever effect God wills them to produce. And not only do they produce this joint effect, but principally, although not simultaneously, they produce their effect in the soul passively, without its being able to hinder this effect, even if it so desired, just as it was also powerless to acquire it, although it had been able previously to prepare itself. For even as the window is powerless to impede the ray of sunlight which strikes it, but when it is prepared by being cleansed, receives its light passively, without any diligence or labor on its own part, even so the soul, although against its will, cannot fail to receive in itself the influences and communications of those figures, however much it might desire to resist them. For the will that is negatively inclined cannot, if coupled with loving and humble resignation, resist supernatural infusions. Only the impurity and imperfections of the soul can resist them, even as the stains upon a window impede the brightness of the sunlight. From this it is evident that when the soul completely detaches itself, in its will and affection, from the apprehensions of the strains of those forms, images, and figures wherein are clothed the spiritual communications which we have described, not only is it not deprived of these communications and the blessings which they cause within it, but it is much better prepared to receive them with greater abundance, clearness, liberty of spirit, and simplicity, when all these apprehensions are set on one side. For they are, as it were, curtains and veils covering the spiritual thing which is behind them. And thus, if the soul desire to feed upon them, they occupy spirit and sense in such a way that the spirit cannot communicate itself simply and freely. For while they are still occupied with the outer rind, it is clear that the understanding is not free to receive the substance. Wherefore, if the soul at that time desires to receive these forms and to set store by them, it would be embarrassing itself, and contenting itself with the least important part of them, namely, all that it can apprehend and know of them, which is the form and image and particular object of the understanding in question. The most important part of them, which is the spiritual part that is infused into the soul, it can neither apprehend nor understand, nor can it even know what it is, or be able to express it, since it is spiritual, purely spiritual. All that it can know of them, as we say, according to its manner of understanding, is but the least part of what is in them, namely the forms perceptible by sense. For this reason I say that what it cannot understand or imagine is communicated by these visions, passively, without any effort of its own to understand, and without its even knowing how to make such an effort. Wherefore the eyes of the soul must ever be withdrawn from all these apprehensions which it can see and understand distinctly, which are communicated through sense, and do not make for a foundation of faith, or for reliance on faith, and must be set upon that which it sees not, and which belongs not to sense, but to spirit, which can be expressed by no figure of sense. And it is this which leads the soul to union in faith, which is the true medium, as has been said. And thus these visions will profit the soul substantially in respect of faith, when it is able to renounce the sensible and intelligible part of them, and to make good use of the purpose for which God gives them to the soul by casting them aside. For as we said of corporeal visions, God gives them not so that the soul may desire to have them, and set its affection upon them. But there arises here the question, if it be true that God gives the soul supernatural visions, but not so that it may desire to have them, or be attached to them, or set store by them, why does he give them at all? Since by their means the soul may fall into many errors and perils, or at the least may find in them such hindrances to further progress as are here described. Especially since God can come to the soul and communicate to it spiritually and substantially that which he communicates to it through sense, by means of the sensible forms and visions aforementioned. We shall answer this question in the following chapter. It involves important teaching, most necessary, as I see it, both to spiritual persons and those who instruct them. For herein is taught the way and purpose of God with respect to these visions, which many know not, so that they cannot rule themselves or guide themselves to union, neither can they guide others to union, through these visions. For they think that just because they know them to be true and to come to God, from God, it is well to receive them and trust them, not realizing that the soul will become attached to them, cling to them, and be hindered by them, as it will by things of the world, if it know not how to renounce these as well as those. And thus they think it well to receive one kind of vision and reject another, causing themselves and the souls under their care great labor and peril in discerning between the truth and the falsehood of these visions. But God does not command them to undertake this labor, nor does he desire that sincere and simple souls should be led into this conflict and danger. For they have safe and sound teaching, which is that of the faith, wherein they can go forward. This, however, cannot be, unless they close their eyes to all that is of particular and clear intelligence and sense. For although St. Peter was quite certain of that vision of glory which he saw in Christ at the Transfiguration, yet after having described it in his second canonical epistle, he desired not that it should be taken for an important and sure testimony, but rather directed his hearers to faith, saying, Et habemus firmiorem propheticum sermonem, qui benefacitis attendentes, quasi lucernoe lucenti in caliginoso loco, donac dias elucescat, which signifies, and we have a surer testimony than this vision of Tabor, namely, the sayings and words of the prophets who bear testimony to Christ, whereunto ye must indeed cling, as to a candle which gives light in a dark place. For if we will think upon this comparison, we shall find therein the teaching which we are now expounding. For in telling us to look to the faith whereof the prophets spake, as to a candle that shines in a dark place, he is bidding us remain in the darkness, with our eyes closed to all these other lights, and telling us that in this darkness, faith alone, which likewise is dark, will be the light to which we shall cling. For if we desire to cling to these other bright lights, namely, to distinct objects of the understanding, we cease to cling to that dark light, which is faith, and we no longer have that light in the dark place whereof St. Peter speaks. This place, which here signifies the understanding, which is the candlestick wherein this candle of faith is set, must be dark until the day when the clear vision of God dawns upon it in the life to come, or in this life, until the day of transformation and union with God to which the soul is journeying. End of chapters 15 and 16.